There are 576 federally recognized tribes in the United States and 4 indigenous tribes, which are native to San Diego in our area. But they do not have the same rights and the same opportunities that many other San Diegans have. And the same is true, as we know, across our nation. The COVID pandemic showed up among many tribes. I can think of right offhand the Navajo, for instance, the terrible inequities that many of our fellow citizens face. So we are delighted to have Dina Gilio Whitaker, who is from the Colville Confederated Tribes, here to speak to us. She's a lecturer of American Indian Studies at Cal State San Marcos and an independent educator in American Indian environmental policy and other issues. At Cal State San Marcos, she teaches courses on environmentalism and American Indians, traditional ecological knowledge, religion and philosophy, Native women's activism, American Indians and sports, and decolonization. She also works within the field of critical sports studies, examining the intersections of indigeneity and the sport of surfing. As a public intellectual, Dina brings her scholarship into focus as an award-winning journalist, with her work appearing at Indian Country Today, one of the newspapers I get, the Los Angeles Times, the High Country News, Time.com, Slate, History.com, Bioneers, Truth Out, the Pacifica Network, Grist, C-SPAN Book Talk, the Boston Globe, and many more. Dina is the author of 2 books, the most recent award-winning As Long as the Grass Grows, The Indigenous Fight for Environmental Justice, From Colonization to Standing Rock. She is currently under contract with Beacon Press for a new book under the working title, Illegitimate Nation, Privilege, Race, and Accountability in the U.S. Settler State. And I can't wait to read that book. It is my great pleasure to introduce Dina Gilio Whitaker.
Thank you so much, Norlin. Why pisnak silk, isquis Dina Gilio Whitaker, ismakalak squis nux buus. And I just greeted you as relatives in my traditional language, which is known as Insukchin. I'm a descendant of the Colville Confederated Tribes of the Snipes Band. And our reservation is up in Washington State, in like near Spokane. And I'm, in the way that we introduce ourselves traditionally, I would, like, if I was in that community, I would say that I'm the daughter of Rosemarie Burnett Gilio, who is the daughter of Mabel Dizitel, and my great-grandmother was Ida O'Brien Dizitel, and I'm related through numerous old Colville families, and the Dizitels and the Peons and the Finleys, and so forth. And the reason that we do this is to establish our responsibility and credibility to our communities and our credibility as Native people in a time where ethnic fraud is so rampant, with lots of people claiming Native heritage but not really having it. Also, I'm coming to you from the traditional and unceded homelands of the Ohashiman Nation, which is currently called Orange County, in the town of San Clemente. So that establishes where I'm at, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. And thank you so much for this invitation to come talk to your group and talk about these really important issues of equity. Because it's really, anytime I get a chance to get invited to speak about a very particular topic, it's a really great way to really focus in, on the research and really think about what are these terms that we're talking about and how do we convey these ideas. Oops. So I'm just going to be talking about, what equity means for American Indians. But first I'll situate myself and tell you how I come to this work, the work that I do as a scholar and an activist, and this title, like public intellectual. I came, again, as a woman who identifies as Sinixt Colville. I actually grew up in Los Angeles. My mother was from the reservation, but she came to LA as a result of federal policy of the 1950s, which was at that time known as termination, where the federal government was literally trying to terminate its relationship with Native people and finally absorb them into, or assimilate them into the American, body politic. And so I teach American Indian Studies, as Norlin already explained, but my research specialty is in environmental justice. And the image that you see here, As Long as Grass Grows, is obviously the title of my last book. And that's where I focused this work on environmental justice. And it came as a result of my undergrad years and then my years in grad school, when I wrote a master's thesis on this topic of environmental justice and what it means for American Indian people. And that's really what brings me to this conversation about equity and justice. And, because in that book, and in the research for doing that book, all throughout those years, I came to realize that this thing that we call environmental justice is really different for Native American people compared to all other communities that we would call EJ communities. And so all the work that I'm doing now around this topic really bounces off from that work, like, really honing in on, like, what does justice mean? What is environmental justice? How is it different? How do we talk about these things in ways that match up with the experience of Native American people? So anyway, in my academic work, I lecture and teach widely, not just on my campus. I also, I have a very robust public speaking schedule, and I do a lot of various kinds of work that I'll talk about in a minute. But on my campus, I am currently holding a position, a faculty fellowship position in the Office of Inclusive Excellence. And, what the work that I'm doing in this position is helping to make these distinctions and educate our faculty and admin and staff on how we talk about the American Indian experience and why it's distinct and different from other ethnic minority communities. And why we need to understand that, and why we need to develop a new language around all of that. In the work that I do is very much even though it's academically based, it's very public facing. So that means that I do a lot of consulting, and that I use that term very loosely. It means that I, in this public speaking schedule that I have, it means that I get invited to speak to a wide variety of different groups, which include conservationists and environmental groups, legal communities, of course, a lot of educational, professional development. I also, and a lot of course, a huge aspect of that is talking to university groups in a wide variety of fields, but especially environmental groups. Also various kinds of nonprofits and for-profit groups, including most recently breaking into the realm of professional sports. So working with this organization called the World Surf League. I love talking about that, but maybe later if you want to know more about that, we can talk about it. But it's really represents some of my work going into private for-profit corporations, that do social justice related and oriented work. And then my work as a journalist. That's really what brings me to the academic world. I started off as a kind of in the streets journalist, as an activist. That's what took me back to school, earning my degrees. And then when I got out of school, I went back into journalism. And so I sort of cross all these different, I don't know, I'm just like into different spaces, which is why my goal is to be able to talk about these really kind of complex topics in ways that are accessible to non-professionally trained people, like people outside of my discipline of American Indian studies. Like, how do we, there's a skill to that, to like how you talk to communities that are outside that lingo and the professional talk that we know characterizes our various disciplines. Okay, so before I jump into the talk, I also want to talk about how we define our terms. And here I'm referring to how we talk about American Indian people. This question comes up a lot. And so to kind of just lay it out, what, the kind of terms, what people will often ask, like, what's the correct term to call American Indian people? Is it okay to say Indians, or is that considered a racial slur? Is it, like politically incorrect or whatever? So there are different terms that get deployed, and American Indian is a term that or Native American or Native. This and by this we also include Alaska Native people. These are people and communities with legal relationships to the state. The terms are fine. American Indians is a good term. It's actually a legal term. It's a legal term that the federal government uses to understand its relationship to us and to refer to us. It will also use Native American. I personally prefer the term American Indian over Native American. And I think it's just because I grew up in a generation that, we grew up knowing ourselves as being Indians, and we were proud of that. Like, I was raised to be proud to be Indian, and I am. And so to me, that's not an offensive racial slur. It's not a great term, doesn't really say who we are, but it's still, to me, it's familiar. The term First Nations sometimes gets applied in the American context, but it's really not accurate. It's a term that the Canadian government uses with its Indigenous people. They'll say Indians as well, but more and more they go with First Nations. And then there's this term Indigenous. The term Indigenous, of course, means something or someone that is native to a particular place. And it's often used interchangeably with American Indian, Alaska Native, or AIAN, but it really depends on the context. Because when depending on how you use the term and who is using it, it can mean something very different. So the term Indigenous is really more often used in a sort of a global sense, like the way that, say, the United Nations uses the term Indigenous peoples, are people basically who have been colonized. But in the context of the state, like the US, you can have Indigenous people who were Indigenous to Mexico, but they're not Indigenous to the US. So they might be Indigenous, but they're not American Indian in the same legal way that American Indians who have that legal relationship to the US are. So it's sort of a catch-all phrase that can be problematic depending on how it's used. And then, so Indian is still acceptable to many. But the best terms that are, to use when talking to somebody individually is their tribal nation itself. But that presents problems too, because like if somebody asks me my ethnicity and I say I'm Sinixt, people will look at me